Maduro wins presidential elections. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro triumphed in the July 28 presidential elections to secure a third term. According to the National Electoral Council, with 80% of voting centers tallied, Maduro had 51.2% of the vote compared to 44.2% for Edmundo González, the main opposition candidate. Chavista supporters took to the streets in jubilant fashion to celebrate the victory. President Maduro hailed the victory as a triumph of national independence and vowed that the country would remain at peace. However, the hardline opposition led by Maria Corina Machado also declared victory and has not recognized the results. In a press conference, Machado and González urged followers to defend the truth and for the armed forces to enforce the results. A tense scenario has raised the prospect of renewed violent protests.
Hello and welcome to another special live broadcast from Venezuela Analysis. We thought we'd run that video summing up a bit of the situation as of the night of the election on July 28th. Obviously, the situation has continued to develop rather rapidly, and our team has been on the ground covering the situation as it develops. And we thought we would go do this event live with you in order to inform you of the situation on the ground. As you know, we have a whole team that is based out of Venezuela working on covering the developments as they happen. But I thought I would begin with a very quick summary, a recap of where we are at in terms of the situation on the ground in Venezuela today. So as you know, as in Sunday, Nicolás Maduro was declared the winner of the election and the electoral authority since has formally declared him the victor. As we can see here in our coverage on the VenezuelaAnalysis.com website, Venezuela's National Electoral Council has formally declared Nicolás Maduro the winner of Sunday's presidential election. On Monday early afternoon, the Venezuelan leader received the credentials that certify his re-election from CNA President Elvis Amoroso. Maduro's third six-year term would officially begin on January 10th, 2025. And Maduro said during the national televised broadcast, "With the humility of a worker, a man of the streets, I assume the mandate of the people to be their president and lead the country to peace, prosperity, and national unity through dialogue." As we know, Maduro was re-elected on Sunday with approximately slightly over 50% of the vote, beating Edmundo González, the standing candidate for the U.S.-backed hardline right-wing opposition. There normally on the campaign trail was Maria Corina Machado, who was disqualified by the Supreme Court from running, and Edmundo González was the standing candidate. Other candidates received slightly over 4% together of the result. Obviously, the situation on the ground has been developing rather quickly, and what we've been seeing over since election night, and obviously into Monday and now Tuesday, has been a very tense situation, a tense election aftermath. And I thought I would bring up this coverage by Venezuela Analysis editor Ricardo Vaz, where he writes, Venezuela's post-electoral scene has been marked by anti-government mobilizations and confrontations with security corps. The unrest has followed the July 28th presidential elections that saw incumbent Nicolás Maduro secure a third term. Since late Sunday, there have been multiple reports of street barricades in different cities with burnt tires or other debris used to block major roads and highways. Transit between Caracas and the country's main airport in La Guaira was interrupted on Monday morning. In the early afternoon, a group of protesters attempted to advance to Miraflores Presidential Palace through the Central Urdaneta Avenue before being stopped by a police cordon. Social media videos showed armed civilians appearing to fire live rounds at the opposition grounds to disperse it. Other social media footage showed protesters with weapons as well as attacking bystanders or security officers. Later in the afternoon, another group of masked activists clashed with the National Guard in El Silencio, close to another access to the presidential palace. A large pro-opposition contingent likewise attempted to march from eastern Caracas, but was stopped by police cordons and eventually dispersed. Social media users reported on mobilizations in a number of Venezuelan cities as well. A mob in the Lara state town of Jimenez set the local city hall on fire on Monday evening. There were unconfirmed reports of 3 people dead, more than 40 wounded. For his part, Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino spoke of 23 wounded servicemen and called on the Venezuelan people to remain calm. So I'll stop it there and bring in my colleague, Cira Pascual Marquina, who has been on the ground as well in Caracas covering the news as it develops. So that was basically a summary of Sunday into Monday. There's been more developments since. Before I hand it over to you, Cira, I think worth reminding our viewers and listeners at the time right now that this in a lot of ways feels familiar to what we've seen before. Certainly in the post-election scenario in the year 2013, after the elections there, we saw the call to hit to the streets very similarly. We began this broadcast with their video where we saw Marina Corina Machado next to the standing candidate Edmundo Gonzalez talking about defending the vote and calling for the armed forces to act against the Constitution. And very similar to 2013. And obviously we know what happened in 2013. It was an outbreak of violence on the streets of what eventually came to be known as guarimbas, which is these violent street protests led by mostly young people who engage in barricades and blockades, many times armed with lethal weapons, burning tires, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that today has been also a very busy day on the streets. Cira, can you fill us in? Let us know what has the situation as of today, Monday at 8:06 p.m. in Caracas?
Well, today was a quite intense day indeed, and thank you, Jose Luis. Today was an intense day because Chavistas and people who are in defense of democracy went out to the streets. In fact, I just came back home about an hour ago from Miraflores Palace, from where people from all around the city walked from different points in the city. People walked there in support of the democratically elected president, Nicolás Maduro, and in support basically of the process, of the democratic process that the Venezuelan people have been living over the past 25 or so years. So this was quite a beautiful day in the sense that, well, it followed yesterday, which was a very, very, very tense day. So as you mentioned, Jose Luis, well, the election results were actually given a little bit past midnight, actually in the very early hours of the 29th of July. And they were given, and they with a high participation of people, actually 59% of the population participated in the elections. Immediately after, basically, as was expected, actually, Maria Corina Machado and her proxy, Edmundo Gonzalez, said that there had been fraud. Now, we were not surprised because they had been talking about there being fraud for months before. This combo is basically a combo that is subjected to the interests of the United States. Maria Corina Machado famously is the one who has called not only for sanctions to Venezuela, but also for intervention, military intervention to Venezuela. So following that event, basically many people, especially yesterday, that being Monday, in the early hours of the morning, but especially through the day, some people who had believed the message that they had won, went out to the streets, and some of them initiated what we call violent guarimbas or street protests. Basically protests where they go to a street and they build a barricade with tires and they burn them and they interrupt traffic. And there were a lot of social media kind of like following the situation. It got very violent. They stormed several PSV centers, houses throughout the country. There were people who were wounded. And in fact, today, there have been other attacks to polling centers, not to polling centers, but to PSV houses today in Carora. So the situation remains intense, but what I can say today is that as opposed to yesterday, which was a very, very tense day for us, for us who believe in democracy and sovereignty, yesterday was a very, very tense day. Today, the people of Venezuela, the working people of Venezuela, the working pueblo, poured into the streets, went to the Miraflores Palace. And it was really beautiful because even though the situation is tense, Venezuelans know how to enjoy what they have to enjoy. Because after all, what we are living is the victory of in the democracy, the continuation of the Bolivarian process, which is a process that proposes to further democracy. So our democracy, the democracy in Venezuela, is not just a representative democracy where every so often, you go to the polls and you choose who's going to represent you for X amount of years. No, Venezuela's democracy is a democracy that basically puts in the center the people in the polls, but also in other spaces. So the communes are also part of of the Venezuelan democracy. Like assemblies are part of Venezuela's democracy. So because of that, because Venezuelans are aware that this is a process that's worth defending today, and because the candidate of the Bolivarian Revolution won today, as people were going to the streets, everybody was very happy. It was pouring. I can see images there. There were thousands of people. It was really, really pouring at times. But people went on chanting, saying, "No pasarán." They will not go through another chant that convoke people to go on defending the sovereignty and the democracy of this Caribbean nation.
So I put up here on the screen some images that we've shared on our social media. We have the pictures of the demonstration, precisely the one you're talking about. Obviously, we hear the motorizados, right? The much maligned, much vilified motorizados, obviously also participating in this. Some coverage of the actual demonstration. But of course, I wanted to talk a bit about the situation. I think there's maybe a lot of people who are concerned that this, in a way, is an echo or similar to what we saw in Bolivia after their elections, where ultimately there was a break in constitutional order. We saw the armed forces in that country ultimately break with the president and actually oust him from office, leading to a dictatorship that was eventually removed. But of course, the situation in Venezuela is different. But there is chatter online that this could potentially be a coup d'etat in progress. What can you tell us about that? Is that an exaggeration? We have this video here from Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino, where he talks, "We reaffirm the most absolute loyalty and unconditional support to Nicolás Maduro Moros, constitutional president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, our commander-in-chief, legitimately reelected by the people's power." So obviously right now we've seen the defense minister, the head of the armed forces, reaffirming his support for the constitutional order, for the democratically elected president. But we have seen a lot of this language. Is this a coup d'etat? Help us understand this, Sira.
Frankly, I have no doubt that if they could, they would do a coup d'etat in Venezuela. In fact, there have been some not so veiled calls for the armed forces to join the Maria Corina Machado sector. So the extreme right-wing US supported opposition, fascist, I would say. So there is no doubt that if they could, they would. There is really no evidence whatsoever that the armed forces, not only because they've said it, but because there's also a history of the Venezuelan armed forces supporting the democratic process. And I should highlight here that it's not just because Maduro won and Chavismo won that they will support it, because, for instance, in 2015. Chavismo got a pretty bad defeat in the National Assembly, and the armed forces, just like Chavismo itself, recognized that situation, the victory of the opposition. So I think it's important to kind of like contextualize this what we are living right now. Yesterday, what we saw in the streets were kids, mostly young kids, who were going out, who were quite angry because they were quite convinced that they had won. I mean, they had been told that they were going to win for months on end, and they also had heard Maria Corina Machado call their own indeed fraudulent so-called victory. So we saw these kids who were willing to actually put, frankly, their lives and the lives of other people in danger. There are a number of security officers who have been wounded, hurt. So the situation, when you put fire in the streets and gasoline, and well, some of them are presumably armed too, well, the situation is quite dangerous. So I would say about going back to the coup d'etat, situation, it's not indeed a situation like the Bolivia situation, the Bolivia coup. We have lived a coup in Venezuela. It wasn't yesterday. It was in 2002. And in that coup, actually, Chavez was deposed. So we do have an experience of that situation. And actually, today in the streets, when we were marching, when people were marching, people were feeling a little bit like it was a counter coup, because there had been that intention of there being a coup. So when people were coming down from the barrios to the center of Caracas, there was that sense of us living a counter coup situation, even if there hadn't actually been a coup. After the coup against Chavez, famously, people came down from the barrios, y bajaron, they came down from the barrios. And today, again, people came down from the barrios, dressed in all colors, with their flags, with their music, with their singing, and especially with their commitment to the sovereignty of a country that has really been under siege since it declared its new Bolivarian phase in 1999. So this is actually is a little bit of a context in terms of how to read the situation vis-a-vis possibilities of coups and comparing it to other situations in Latin America. We are not going to witness a coup, I think. I'm quite convinced. But the situation is still tense. We should, those of you who are listening to us and who are solidarious with the Bolivarian process, or anybody who is committed to the sovereignty of any other country, all those people should, be tuned to what's going on. We are reporting from Venezuela Analysis, and just like express your solidarity with the Bolivarian process.
I'm glad you brought up the 2002 coup, because it makes me think about the context at the time. This was now many, many, many years ago, but we should remember that it was called the first media coup, that there was a whole media narrative that was behind this, that's trying to convince people at the time that Chavez resigned. There was this famous speech given by the armed forces at the time that was recorded before everything went down. And I bring that up because I think that there's some parallels to what's happening now, in the sense that we've seen this deliberate effort in the lead up to the election to try to make it seem that the only legitimate outcome was going to be an opposition victory. This harping on these opinion polls that were later debunked by not even anybody who's pro-government. There's a commentator, Venezuelan commentator, Francisco Rodriguez, who actually went through the effort of saying these are the ways that the polls have misrepresented the opposition support in the past, overestimating it, making an argument that the race was actually much closer. There were other opinion polls. I know that the Chavistas are often sympathetic to what Interlaces has to say. Curiously, Interlaces, their pre-election poll actually had a lot of this very similar result that we actually ultimately saw on the election. And so there's been this deliberate narrative to try to craft this idea that the only legitimate result was the opposition winning, that it was going to be a landslide, and that if Maduro won, it was obviously a fraud. But I wanted to bring something else in particular up, because what we saw was also exit polls that suggested that that the winner was Edmundo Gonzalez. And this is a report from Ben Norton, who has done a lot of work covering Latin America. And he actually tracked down what is the background. We saw with the Washington Post in particular all day on Sunday parroting this news. The exit poll by this reputable firm, so-called reputable firm, had been promoting this idea that Edmundo Gonzalez had won by a landslide, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into the details of it, but it turns out it's a government-linked firm. Edison Research is a firm that has worked with other government forces in the United States in the past. So this is not necessarily an unbiased source, and it should be, we should be cautious about giving any kind of reliability to the claims being made by this exit poll. And I think a lot of the narrative that's being put out there is relying very heavily on this information that is coming from this polling agency. So if people are interested, they can check out this source here. But I also wanted to bring in this piece of information I was really disappointed to see, although not surprised, that Amnesty International put up this video talking about, I'll restart it here so we can see the beginning of it, talking about people protesting on the streets of the so-called disputed election there, thousands gathering, et cetera, et cetera. But as you'll see in the video, what they do is try to claim as if that the police are repressing peaceful protests and that they're using tear gas and rubber bullets against them. And obviously, they're not showing any of the scenes that we've been witnessing on the streets of the violent protests, the guarimbas, again, insisting that this is something that is not unknown to Venezuelans or people who follow Venezuela. This is stuff that has happened before. Again, closing on this call, protect the protests, as if the government forces are cracking down on peaceful protests. That did not happen. There was a peaceful protest today by the opposition. There was no crackdown. Right? There was no crackdown. And I think it's important to highlight that. But I think it also obeys the idea that this narrative that Venezuela is an authoritarian regime, that it's only cracking down, et cetera, et cetera. And as I said here on this tweet, right, security forces are basically trying to contain a violent fascist uprising. We've already seen some very disturbing images. I'll see if I can get those up on the screen quickly here from the Lara state. They were somewhat disturbing. So I'll caution our viewers who are watching us right now of the kind of violence we've seen on the ground here. Terrible scenes of a group of masked men attacked and lit ablaze the Socialist Party headquarters in Carora Lara state, which is home to a radio station. Reports of 3 people being seriously injured. I won't show this last video here because it's actually quite graphic. There's someone who's quite injured. I'll see if I can somewhat censor that, but you can see the images. This is what's happening. Amnesty International doesn't show these images. They show protests. They show police firing tear gas, but they don't show the truth. So that's why we appreciate everybody who's tuning into us right now and watching our on-the-ground coverage. I want to bring in Ricardo Vaz, who has joined us as well, editor at the Venezuela Analysis website, who's also been on the ground covering things. Ricardo, thanks for joining us. It's a little bit dark where you are, but I guess it's later than it is in the central time zone. It's 8:20, 2 p.m. over there in Caracas, Venezuela. Maybe he can get a light on in a bit. But Ricardo, thanks for joining us. Let us know. Sierra filled us in. Let us know what she saw on the streets today. But we thought we would hear from you. What have you been witnessing on the streets of Caracas today? What's the situation on the ground in Venezuela?
Yeah, I've just come back from the march and then concentration in Miraflores Palace, where Maduro joined the crowds and gave a speech. It was an impressive mobilization. I confess that at some point it felt like, there's very few people here, but it was also, there were several periods of torrential rain, and these were marches that were coming from at least 2 different points of Caracas. As Cira might have mentioned, she was in the march that came from the west. There was another that came from the east, or from the central part. And there was, as always, as you find in these Chavista marches, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of joy, lots of singing, but also a lot of defiance, this idea that, they're not going to let this far-right movement take control of the streets. And actually, I'm not sure if you've discussed this before, but apart from the violence and, setting up barricades, clashing with security forces, there have also been several episodes of targeting of grassroots leaders, attacking them, chasing them in their homes. And this is something that's very symptomatic, which is, if this is what they do after they feel they won an election, imagine what they would do if they were actually in power. And so one of the things that Maduro said in his speech was that, he kind of updated on the response, on the security apparatus response to this unrest and the number of arrests. He mentioned that, the arrests are in the hundreds right now, that, many of them had actually started surrendering information of their ties to, not that they are, the narrative is always that these are spontaneous protests. And, we shouldn't rule it out that there's legitimate discontent in general. People are right to, they have the right to be against the government. They have the right to be discontent. They have a right to protest. And there are plenty who might be unhappy about the results that were announced by the Electoral Council. So there's a lot of that. But there's also a very clear signs that there's an orchestrated plan to sow chaos, to generate instability in a way that will perhaps trigger some kind of constitutional breakdown, a coup d'etat, lots of things that we've seen in the past, kind of the rehashed guarimbas. But, with this particular element of specifically targeting recognized Chavista leaders in the territories, and this was one of the things that Maduro said was going to be, that the government, the security state, the security forces were not going to tolerate, and this was quite well received by the crowd. So the situation now is, I'm coming from this march where there was this kind of enthusiasm in support of Maduro and the government, but the situation in general is much calmer. I actually ran through a kind of a parade of cacerolazos on my way home. This is a relatively pro-opposition area, but now it seems to have quieted down again. And today, as you were just mentioning, the opposition held its march in East Caracas, and it was fine. Maria Corina had her usual incendiary rhetoric at hand. So, but the question is, what happens next? Is this calm here to stay? Is there going to be a reopening of normal activities? Because today, Caracas, and I imagine most of the country, was kind of a ghost town. There was no public transportation. Very few shops and service providers were open. So are we going to see a kind of a gradual return to normalcy in the coming days, or is this perhaps a crisis to continue? Maduro, for his part, called for a kind of permanent mobilization with different groups going every day to Miraflores Palace, while also setting up some, this is something that's very common in him, calling for dialogue initiatives in a way that will hopefully help, diffuse the tension in the coming days and perhaps allow cooler heads to prevail.
So I wanted to see if we could keep talking a little bit more about what's going to happen next. I think it's important for people to certainly keep attention to what's happening in Venezuela. I think it's important that there be international solidarity in this moment, but also we shouldn't overstate things, because before you joined us, Ricardo, Cira, and I were talking about how a lot of this is driven by a narrative. There's a deliberate effort to try to craft a certain image that, there is no support for Maduro, that obviously the only way he could have won was by fraud, et cetera, et cetera. You just finished telling us about the situation on the ground, that there was a turnout, there has been mobilization. There are obviously people who do support the government, despite what the mainstream bourgeois media will have you believe. But obviously the international aspect does matter. And so I wanted to bring on here on the screen the message that came out just about a couple of hours ago at this point now from President Biden. I'll read it out to those who are maybe just listening. It says, "Today I spoke with President Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva to discuss a range of bilateral regional issues, including the emergent political situation in Venezuela following the presidential election. We agree on the need for an immediate full release of full, transparent, and detailed voting data at the polling station level by the Venezuelan electoral authorities, and we remain pledged to remain in close coordination on the issue." So that's the reaction from Washington. It actually sounds like a bit of a softer line that they usually have taken when it comes to Venezuela. Usually we were used to the kinds of, this is the Maduro regime, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, the messaging here from the President Biden is actually softer than what we've seen in some mainstream media, where it talks about the authoritarian dictator in Venezuela was allegedly reelected, right? And here they're talking in plain language following the presidential election, et cetera. So with that being said, what do we have to do in terms of the international context? We've seen many countries in the region recognized, but we've also seen some very negative forces, namely Gabriel Boric in Chile, trying to position himself as a leftist, as a progressive, and also criticizing what's happening in Venezuela. I'm not really sure what his aim is, but it's out there and people are running with it. It's important to mention because it's being treated as if he is a legitimate intervener in this process, and as if it's somewhat more legitimate because he pretends to be a leftist. So we'll go to Cira first. What do we do with the international situation? What do you make of the U.S. President Biden's statement, and where do things stand in the region right now in terms of the relationship diplomatically with Venezuela?
So indeed, the statement from Biden was a little bit softer, but basically it comes accompanied by the mainstream media going against the electoral process in Venezuela. Oftentimes people ask me, are Venezuela's election free and fair? And generally I say, frankly, No, because this is a country that is sanctioned by the US. It's a country that is in a terrible economic crisis due to the US sanctions. And the US sanctions are weighing the situation in favor of the opposition, because the opposition is the one that's calling for sanctions. So that's why when people ask me if these are free and fair elections, I will say no, because this is not a plain level ground. Because there's so much going against the Bolivarian process internationally in terms of US intervention via the sanctions, and also kind of like corporate media and all the interest of the international and imperialist bourgeoisie. So when we look at the international situation, indeed, what Borg has been doing is a little bit concerning, but I don't think it's going to have necessarily so much traction. We will see it. I do not have a crystal ball. I do not think that it will have so much traction if in the next, by tomorrow or the day after, the tension in the streets of Caracas especially, but also around the country, goes down. We will see what happens. But my suspicion is that the street violence is going to indeed go down. I wanted to go back to something that you had been reflecting on, Jose Luis, which was about the whole thing with the exit polls, because the exit polls are kind of like one of the elements that they have been waiving. These exit polls that you were mentioning actually were funded by the Wall Street Journal, if we are talking about the same one. Basically, we know that this is not necessarily a reliable media in terms of people's struggles. It's like Wall Street's journal. So it's the journal of the bourgeoisie and of the US bourgeoisie and of the Wall Street bourgeoisie. So it would be very, frankly, idiotic of anybody to take the media of the Wall Street bourgeoisie as a media that is supporting something that is committed to a grassroots movement, to a grassroots project, to the Bolivarian project that aspires, even though it of course has a long way to go, and it's gone sometimes forward and sometimes walk backward, but a project that aspires towards socialism and towards collective emancipation. So I think it's important to put it in that context. I should add that in Venezuela, exit polls are not legal. And that means that when you do exit polls, it kind of like, if you are on the task of doing exit polls, of measuring what people voted, you are probably not going to do it in the best conditions. I actually think it's good that exit polls are not allowed. I mean, I don't know why the voters should be influenced by what supposedly other voters are voting for. But in any case, it's not legal in Venezuela to do exit polls. So these polls that are supposed to be so scientific and so on are actually very, very limited in terms of what they can do. And in fact, they showed something totally false in terms of the results. So yeah, that would be a little bit about my perspective on the international situation. But I do want to emphasize that to the degree that Venezuela's democracy is not free and fair, one has to put there first and foremost the US sanctions, which make the life of Venezuelans very, very difficult. And of course, millions of Venezuelans have had to leave Venezuela because the situation here is indeed very difficult for the working people.
Yeah, and interestingly, we saw the Washington Post, which was the one that was most loudly kind of banging the drum for regime change, giving an audience to the opposition claims that they had won. They're the ones who were publishing this exit poll widely and broadly. They actually, a few days earlier to the election, had published a lengthy report about the impact of sanctions and this tendency by U.S. policymakers, the White House, to insist on sanctions as a legitimate tool. We remind our listeners that it's something that we've covered extensively at Venezuela Analysis. We wrote a whole book about it called A War Without Bombs, covering the impact, the political, economic, and social impact of sanctions on Venezuela. And of course, reminding all people who are tuning in that sanctions are illegal. If they're not actually implemented by an accredited international body, they are not legal in international law. It's been widely understood. There's been numerous reports. You can look it up yourself. The UN has come out saying that unilateral coercive measures, as sanctions are more properly known, are not legal in international law. They do not have standing, and they're collective punishment. That is also against international law, and yet these are treated as legitimate. And I think I love the way you turn that phrase on its head, Sierra, saying that, they're not free and fair, but not free and fair because there's a dictatorship. They're not free and fair because there's a punishing, brutal, deadly sanctions regime being imposed on Venezuela. I mean, for people who perhaps are not aware of Venezuela's economy, as obviously their number one commodity export is oil. It is known as the country with the largest reserves. And of course, the sanctions make it virtually impossible for them to sell oil on the international market in an open way. They have to go through intermediaries. That invites corruption. It invites a lot of losses of sometimes they are not even paid for their shipments, et cetera, et cetera. And so they've managed to survive thus far as a result. But I think it's important to remind that. Ricardo, I wanted to jump to you as well to talk about the international situation, get your take on this. Where do you see things standing in terms of the regional relationship and obviously the U.S. relationship with imperialism bearing down on Venezuela right now?
Yeah, I would pick up where Ciro said that as long as tensions on the ground ease in the coming days, if they continue the trend that we saw today, then they will also ease on the international scene. It amazes me that suddenly everyone is an expert in the Venezuelan electoral system. For years, people just say, "Oh, there was fraud, the elections were a sham, we don't trust them," and now all of a sudden they are experts in the audits and the results and the transmission. There were a couple of or 7 countries actually that took stances that the Venezuelan government took offense, and yesterday there was quite a forceful diplomatic position in recalling with diplomatic staff from, I might forget some, but it was Argentina, Chile, Panama, Peru, the Dominican Republic, I think Ecuador, and I'm missing, and Argentina, I think. I'm surely missing another. But anyway, this was quite a strong stance, but also something that the Venezuelan government has been known for, having kind of a non-negotiable position that there should be no meddling in its internal affairs. And in that sense, the position taken by Brazil, Colombia, and also Mexico, Mexico is much more forceful in this kind of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs. It's been kind of a staple in Mexican foreign policy, so that's always welcome. But Brazil and Colombia, and I think that also there's kind of Brazilian influence in Biden's statement, have taken this wait and see and hope for the full results to be divulged by the National Electoral Council. The authorities, both electoral authorities and also the Attorney General and other Venezuelan officials have talked about a massive hacking attack, a non-stop hacking attack. There was actually an article today on Sputnik explaining how that affects the transmission and totalization of results. So there has been a delay in the publishing of official results. So the CNE declared Maduro the winner with only 80% of the voting centers tallied, but with what they termed an irreversible trend in terms of his advantage. There's also been a flurry of people who understand nothing about statistics saying that because there were more votes than what Edmundo Gonzalez had to overcome, then it wasn't irreversible. That's not how statistics work. But anyway, certainly our hope is that tensions are going to continue to ease in the coming days. Certainly, Monday was terrible in terms of unrest, and there were legitimate fears that this would be the start of a new, perhaps even intensified Guarimba period. But then looking back, most of the flashpoints were very ephemeral. Masked youth would light up a barricade on fire, and then police would come, they would run away. There were also more serious clashes in parts of town, but then in the others, for example, this big march that was coming from the east, and there's a long history. We only have to remember the 2002 coup. What happens when these significant crowds come into the west of Caracas and clash with the more traditional bastions of Chavismo? And so security forces have learned their lessons over the years, and so they set up these cordons and then disperse the crowds largely without incident. These aren't kind of battle-ready crowds from the opposition that are there to pick a fight. And so in that way, the police and the National Guard have been kind of ahead of their game in terms of avoiding any serious escalation of tensions, which isn't to say that things don't escalate in specific cases. And of course, we shouldn't just write a blank check and allow security forces to just do whatever they want. There should be accountability, and usually it is delayed, and sometimes it takes international complaints before Venezuelan authorities act. It's also worth saying that there are cases of impunity, but for now, I think the result we've seen so far is that tensions have eased, and if that continued, then it should also allow for kind of a normal resumption, not only of daily life, but also the conclusion of the electoral process, and with that will come the normal international reactions that you would expect after a contest like this.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that and kind of put things in perspective for us in terms of historical context. Obviously, we are familiar with the guarimbas of the past, namely those that happened in 2013, 2014, 2017. And I'm comforted to hear that from what you're seeing, it's not to the same degree. They don't look to have the same kind of sustainability. We know that ultimately it emerged that many of the youth who were participating in this were likely being paid to be there. So it's, hard to think that they could possibly be in the same situation and having that kind of support over the long term. Again, I think, like I said, I'm comforted by the notion that things seem to be settling down. I wanted to come back to this point around the data, right? So the president of the CNE said that within 48 hours, the official numbers would be published. We haven't seen those as of yet. I think that's important to see those eventually, because those will sort of calm many of the concerns that we've been hearing thus far. But I wanted to put on the screen this image here. Now, this is the page. This is live. So this is not a screen capture by any sense of the word. This is the website that was shared by the opposition, by Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, saying that this is where you could find out what the results. They're claiming that they have the tally sheets. Somehow they had access to them, and that the tally sheets give them the victory. And they're, sharing some pretty absurd numbers, saying they have upwards of 72% of the vote. It seems hard to believe, given the situation on the ground in Venezuela, given that they don't have a very efficient vote polling machine, that they don't have the same experience actually getting people to the polls, given that while they certainly did have a large turnout to some of their demonstrations, the closing demonstration was dwarfed by the pro-government one. So to think that they were able to secure that many votes seems hard to believe. Whereas if you look at the figures historically, there's certainly a drop. If we extrapolate the results that we have seen, it'd be somewhere around 6 million votes for Maduro. That's around what they've received historically. Obviously, Chavez was able to secure more. 2013 actually was one of the high points in terms of the amount of support. 2012 under Chavez. But in line with the base that does exist for the United Socialist Party and the Gran Polo Patriótico. But I do think it's worth highlighting this. I mean, this was supposed to be, the smoking gun by the opposition, and you can't even access any of the data. You can click OK, you go by Buscar por Estado, and not even the captcha works. So whatever they set up here does not work whatsoever. There are some outlets that are claiming that they have seen the data, but it's not available to the public. So, if the argument is transparency, and then that's the reason why it's legitimate to be out on the streets the way that they're demanding people to go out there, well, they're not offering transparency in their own case. So I wanted to hear from you two in terms of what's your take on the messaging that's coming from the opposition, that they are actually the victors, that they secured 70% of the vote, and therefore, Maduro called it today, this is Guaidó 2.0, right? That they are now declaring Edmundo Gonzalez to be the legitimately elected president of Venezuela. So your thoughts? We'll start with Sierra.
So, I have heard one or two people that actually have been able to go into this platform of the opposition, but most people, overwhelming number of people, have not been able to do it. So basically, they claim that they have more than 70% of what we call the chorizo, which is kind of like a long paper that is emitted by the machines. And the truth is that actually, if they have some or many of them, it would not be surprising, because Venezuela's electoral system allows and actually facilitates the participation of observers from all the parties that are participating on the electoral process. So on the one hand, that we should recognize that they can have these copies of these chorizos, of these long, the results. Because that is precisely one of the elements in kind of like proofing the electoral system of Venezuela. So there were thousands of opposition observers in the polling centers. There were actually also 900 international observers in Venezuela, none of which so far have said that they saw any irregularities in the process. And I think it's important as we think about this, the claims, of course, it is true. The CNE, the National Electoral Council, well, there was this attack on it. We still have to see the results. But more importantly, we kind of have to look at the situation in perspective, to the degree that there was a transmission of the results, the transmission of the results was clearly in one direction. That was, we are not questioning that. What people would like to see is how their polling center went on and so on. So I want to say one last thing, because this whole thing about claiming fraud was, as we've talked about before, kind of like a situation set by the media by months before. And actually, on the night of the elections, on the 28th, which is also, by the way, Chavez's birthday, on the 28th, while the opposition had all these observers in as many polling centers as they could put observers in, that was up to them. Of course, they wouldn't have observers in it's not likely that all parties would have observers in all the polling centers. But as this happened, there were also very violent stormings of many polling centers. In fact, one polling center very near me, there was very, very intense attempt to storm it, and it was very violent, and it was I know actually a person who was wounded trying to defend this opposition mob from going in, even though inside there were actually opposition observers, but they wanted to wreak havoc in the whole situation. I don't know if that's part of the plan or if that was spontaneous. I don't have that kind of inside information, but it does seem to be kind of part of a coordinated effort to claim fraud in the elections.
I'm looking at our comments here, and somebody is telling me that that's no longer the website, that they have a different one. So I brought up the one that they mentioned here. And the only thing that's available is you can check the actas or the tally page, but putting in your cédula. So I haven't gone through the experience, but in the interest of transparency, this is apparently the new website. But I will note that the search by state is no longer available. So this information apparently is only available by putting in your cédula. I know that I've talked to people in Venezuela who are not comfortable sharing their cédula with the opposition's website. So we can make up a number, but as far as we know, that is all the information that they're providing. Ricardo, I wanted to come back to you and hear your thoughts here on the messaging that's coming from the opposition.
Yeah, I mean, Sierra has mostly covered it, but the opposition, and here we're talking about Maria Corina Machado, most of all. I mean, she's the one setting the narrative, essentially set out this idea that, there was no way that they were not going to win. And I think that's what, in the end, triggers or encourages these kinds of mobs trying to storm polling centers, even though there were already opposition witnesses inside the polling centers, and also perhaps encourage the kind of violence we saw on Monday after the results were announced. As for this, let's say parallel opposition effort to publish results, I mean, even with the new website, I've seen reports of people who cannot access it, and even the ones that do. I mean, there are some people on social media who say that, here's the chorizo, the tally that I took a photo of in my voting center, and it matches the one that's presented online. So I'm sure that in the coming days there will also be more clarity once people can make a more exhaustive analysis of this website. which, as you said, remains very limited if you can only search by cedula. But at the end of the day, the ball is in the CNE court. As many political organizations, not just the Socialist Party, but many political organizations have stressed, the CNE is the arbiter. That this is the body with not just the capability, but with the responsibility of declaring electoral results. And so, again, we hope that these issues with hacking attacks from outside can be sorted, and then once there's more clarity about the results, that it leads to either hopefully an easing of tensions, but also kind of deflating this idea these narratives that are giving weight and breathing life into what we can call, I don't know, I wouldn't call it an outright coup attempt, but perhaps a simmering coup attempt that might also escalate. I mean, it might be independent of getting more clarity and transparency. It might be just something that's already in motion. This is something that Maduro said, and several Chavista leaders have said that the plan was never electoral. It was just the opening stage of a conspiracy to take power by violent means, which is also something that the opposition has tried to do in the past. So, I mean, for now, we are glad that the situation has calmed down, but there are still these several fronts open, and Venezuelan Analysis, of course, is going to keep an eye on all of them and report very regularly. I mean, luckily, Siri and I have glasses, but we have significant eye bags for lack of sleep in recent days. But we feel that that's a necessary work, given just how easy misinformation runs, that we can actually provide accurate information based on what we're seeing on the ground, and also what we get from our sources, not just in Caracas but throughout the country, to present an accurate picture of what's going on in Venezuela in a way that's useful, not just for people to get informed, but also for solidarity movements to get more information and actually oppose efforts by their governments to undermine the internal affairs here in Venezuela.
Yes, of course. I want to remind everybody who's watching and listening to check out our website, venezuelanalysis.com. Before the election, we ran a fundraising campaign. Of course, we are more than happy to receive any donations. As you can see, the team is on the ground. These are dedicated journalists who are working to bring you the information. Ricardo Vaz, editor of venezuelanalysis.com. Cira Pascual Marquina, who obviously brings us all of the interviews on every Friday of different actors who are working on the ground, the grassroots of Chavismo, who are still committed to the socialist horizon. Ultimately, some of that gets lost in this conversation, that what we're talking about is two competing visions. One that is about handing over the country and its resources to the owners of capital, to transnational capital, to U.S. imperialism, and the other side, which is one that is still interested in reaching that socialist horizon, that is still building under the most adverse of circumstances. We talked a bit during this program about the impact of sanctions. That's one of the things that continues to be a demand, regardless of the situation that happens here in the post-election scenario, which is that sanctions are illegal, they're unjust, they're brutal, they're murderous, and they need to be lifted immediately without any condition. They should not have been tolerated in the first place. The U.S. is going through its own electoral process now, but foreign policy tends not to play a big role, although maybe in this one it will, as a result of the genocide that's going on in Palestine. But obviously, it'd be good to have people, if you are watching and listening in the United States, to also pressure politicians in your communities at the federal level to talk about these illegal sanctions and call for a lifting of that. There's many groups on the ground that are doing that work, that are friends of venezuelanalysis.com as well. But also I wanted to really insist on this, that as you can see, that the Venezuelan Analysis team is not someone who just parachutes in. They are people who have been living and working in Venezuela for years and who are committed to the people's struggle. And so if you're able to, please visit our website. There's a big red donate button at the top and help support our work. We're almost at the end of our program now, but I did want to open up back to Cira and Ricardo for any last words here. Again, I just wanted to remind everybody that the scenarios, what we're seeing on the ground in Venezuela right now, they are worrisome. Obviously, no one wants to see the kinds of outbreaks of violence that we have seen, these images across our social media. We shouldn't overstate it either. The situation, thankfully, as we heard throughout this program, seems to be reaching a calm. But above all, what Venezuelans want is peace. They want to be able to live their lives free of sanctions, free of U.S. interference, free of these far-right actors who are inviting international condemnation and international action. And remember, at one point there was voices calling for armed military intervention in Venezuela. These are the same people who also supported the fake president of Juan Guaido, and are now trying to pretend like Edmundo Gonzalez is the president. So remember that this is not new to the people of Venezuela, these kinds of tactics, this attempted simmering coup, as Ricardo put it. But obviously the people of Venezuela also are marching on the streets, drawing on their history. Cira reminded us earlier today of the 2002 attempted coup against Chavez that was overturned by the masses. Never discount the masses and the working class, the campesinos of Venezuela. So like I said, I wanted to hand it over back to Cira and Ricardo before we log off here. Cira, some parting words for our watchers and our listeners.
So basically, I'm going to speak not as a journalist or as somebody who works for Venezuela analysis, but I don't know, as a person who is committed to both grassroots struggles and is definitely an anti-imperialist. I think that there's many reasons both to be concerned, but also to be solidarious, to be concerned about the current situation, but to be solidarious with the Bolivarian process. And this is my call, my personal call, as also as a grassroots organizer to some degree, an educator, in relation to what we are seeing. I mean, you might support the Bolivarian process, or you might be concerned about the current situation just because you are aware, as a listener, you are aware that the US is trying to overthrow a democratically elected government and has been trying to do it for the last, since basically Hugo Chavez came into power. So if you are somebody who's an anti-imperialist and who is committed to the sovereignty of people of the world, of the peoples of the world, then be concerned and solidarious with the people of Venezuela. Also, if you think that in the current capitalist society, the democracy, the limited forms of democracy that exist, the so-called representative or democracy that is prevalent around the world, which is hegemonically capitalist, if you think that this model is a very incomplete model, there's a lot to learn from the Bolivarian process and the substantive democracy that Chavez promoted. Of course, that doesn't mean that everything here is perfect. There are many imperfections in the Bolivarian process, but there is a lot to learn here about what there is going on here. So if you are committed to thinking, or if you think that we have to, around the world, the working people of the world have to build a new form of democracy, then also that's a reason to be solidarious and to look to Venezuela. Of course, Venezuela is not the center of the world, but well, these people have something to offer to the world. And finally, if you are committed to socialism, to building a post-capitalist society, but not only in words, but also, like with substance, if you are aware that, of course, building socialism is not easy, but you think that there might be a path, then the communes are an important reference. I think the communes could be an important reference for anybody, because the communes offer, which is Chavez's proposal for, is kind of like Chavez's pathway and end goal in terms of building socialism. The communes are something that you can look at, and you can be solidarious with the people of Venezuela, because they are, from my perspective, solidarious with the world as they, in small spaces, in spaces that are still, like germinating, that it's still beginning to consolidate, that are not fully formed, these communes. There we see the first elements of new social relations emerging with grassroots democracy at the core. So I think that for those three reasons, it's important for us, for those of you who are listening, and for those of us who are here in Venezuela, well, I think it's good to build kind of like this going back and forth and a movement of solidarity with the people of Venezuela, because they are building an alternative in the worst of conditions against imperialism.
Yeah, I mean, Sierra took off her journalist hat, so will I. And I'll talk more as a kind of geopolitical analyst, which is not something that we overdo at Venezuela. And my recommendation to people is that we shouldn't lose sight of the big picture. We shouldn't lose sight of imperialism and its never-ending goal to subjugate its quote unquote backyard, Latin America. We just did a 2-part interview with Carlos Ron. He's the president here of the Instituto Simón Bolívar, which is responsible for a lot of relations with foreign grassroots organizations. And so not lose sight of the big picture and what imperialism ultimately wants to achieve in Venezuela, not just in terms of securing access to the vast natural resources that are here, but also killing off a project that challenged, to subvert Obama's own sentence, provided an unusual and extraordinary threat to the U.S. hegemony here in the region. So, as the events in the coming days unfold, of course, get as informed as possible, but do not lose sight of the big picture. And, to get as informed as possible, and also not to lose sight of the big picture, stay tuned to Venezuela Analysis on our website, on our social media, our newsletter. There's really no shortage of ways to stay up to date with all the developments in Venezuela.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Thank you so much, Cira. We've been joined by the Venezuela Analysis team that has been on the ground with very long days and long nights covering the situation. Stay tuned to the work of Venezuela Analysis. Keep in touch with those of us here doing our best job possible to try to share with you the information. We have our website here on the screen, venezuelaanalysis.com. If you're able, the donate button is at the top. Please support us if you can. Like I said, Venezuela Analysis is based in Venezuela, is on the ground doing the work of bringing you grassroots journalism, grassroots perspective, the grassroots of the Chavismo, as well as, various perspective as well, bringing you news briefs, bringing you analysis. There's the interview that Ricardo mentioned, of course, multimedia, infographics, podcasts, which I'm the host of, videos and galleries. We're always trying to find different ways of bringing you this information. But right now, in this moment where international solidarity is needed, please continue to follow VenezuelaAnalysis.com, as well as our social media channels on Twitter, now known as X, on Telegram, on YouTube. For those of you who are joining us there, please give us a like, subscribe to our content, and share with your friends. Again, I want to thank, above all, Ricardo and Cira, who are on the ground, who've had very long days and been doing this work, for sharing us and also giving us a bit of a sense of comfort. I feel a lot better after this conversation, knowing that the situation does look to be improving, but of course that situation can change. And if it does, you can count on us to bring you the information as it happens. And if necessary, we'll do another live and we'll be in touch with you directly this way. This is a new format for us, but we find that it's working pretty well. We're getting a good audience here. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Jose Luis Granado Ceja, and I've been joined by Ricardo Vaz and Cira Pascual Marquina. We'll see you next time.